She treated the elderly black customer like an unwanted guest until he revealed his Air Force medals. When the security guard saluted him, the restaurant went completely silent. James Wilson's hands trembled slightly as he fastened the last button of his Air Force uniform. He stood before the mirror in his bedroom, the morning light catching the polished brass buttons and medals that adorned his chest. The uniform still fit perfectly, even at 70. His fingers brushed against the fabric, smoothing out invisible wrinkles. "Almost ready," he muttered, reaching for the small wooden box on his dresser. Inside lay his most recent medal, awarded just yesterday. The medal felt cool against his fingers as he pinned it alongside the others. The clock on his bedside table read 11:30 a.m. James grabbed his cap and keys, his movements deliberate and practiced. The drive to Freeman's restaurant would take about 20 minutes, enough time to arrive for lunch, just like he used to with Sarah. His old Buick purred to life. The streets of downtown had changed since his last visit 3 years ago. New buildings towered where family shops once stood, and sleek coffee shops replaced the diners he remembered. But Freeman's remained, its red brick exterior now sporting a fresh coat of paint and a new sign, Matthews Fine Dining Est. 1962, James gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Still Freeman's to me," he said to himself, pulling into the parking lot. The hostess stand visible through the window was new. Cherry wood and chrome instead of the old mahogany podium where Mr. Freeman himself used to greet guests. A young couple exited the restaurant, the woman laughing at something her partner said. They paused when they saw James stepping out of his car, their eyes lingering on his uniform before quickly looking away. James straightened his cap and squared his shoulders. This was supposed to be a good day, a celebration. He'd promised Sarah they'd come back here after every major milestone. Even after she passed, he kept that promise. "One last time," he whispered, pushing open the heavy glass door. The familiar chime rang above his head. The hostess, a young woman with carefully styled blonde hair, looked up from her phone. Her practiced smile faltered for a split second. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome to Matthews. James removed his cap. "Table for one, please." She hesitated, glancing toward the back office. "Do you have a reservation?" "No, ma'am. Never needed one before." The restaurant was only half full. Empty tables lined the windows, their white tablecloths catching the midday sun. Let me check with my manager." The hostess hurried toward the back, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. James waited, standing straight, hands clasped behind his back. He could feel eyes on him, other diners stealing glances between bites of their meals. A child at a nearby table pointed at his medals, only to have his hand quickly pushed down by his mother. The smell of grilled steak and fresh bread filled the air, exactly as he remembered. The layout hadn't changed much. The same booth where he and Sarah celebrated his first promotion still sat in the corner, though its red leather had been replaced with sleek black upholstery. A sharp voice cut through his memories. "Is there a problem here?" Karen Matthews emerged from the back office, her pink blazer a stark contrast to the restaurant's muted tones. She was younger than James expected, maybe mid-40s, with carefully styled brown hair and a pearl necklace that caught the light as she moved. "No problem, ma'am," James replied. "Just hoping to have lunch?" Karen's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I see. And you don't have a reservation?" "No, ma'am. Used to come here often, back when it was Freeman's. Thought I'd visit again after the ceremony yesterday." He gestured to his newest medal. She glanced at his uniform, her expression tightening. "I'm sorry, but we're quite busy today. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the diner down the street? They're more casual." The hostess shifted uncomfortably behind Karen, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Ma'am," James said, his voice steady, "there are plenty of empty tables. I've been coming here for over 40 years. That was under different management," Karen replied, her voice rising slightly. "We have certain standards now." A few diners had stopped eating, their forks suspended mid-bite. A man in a business suit at the bar turned to watch, his phone discreetly raised. James felt heat rise in his neck, but his voice remained calm. "And what standards would those be, ma'am?" "We cater to a specific clientele," Karen said, stepping closer. "I'm sure you understand." "Now, if you'll please dash, I understand perfectly," James interrupted, his metals catching the light as he straightened. I understood it in 1965 when I had to use the back door, even in uniform. I understood it in 1970 when I returned from Vietnam. And I understand it now. Karen's face flushed. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. More phones appeared, recording the confrontation. A woman at a nearby table gasped softly. You know, James said, looking around the restaurant, my wife and I celebrated our engagement in that corner booth. Mr. Freeman himself brought us champagne. Said any man willing to die for his country deserved the best table in the house. That's not relevant, Karen snapped. This is my establishment now, and I have the right to refuse service to anyone. James nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am, you do. But you should know something. He touched his newest medal. This was awarded for 40 years of service. 40 years of fighting, so people like you could have the right to treat people like me this way. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to watch. I'm calling security, Karen announced, pulling out her phone. James stood his ground, decades of military bearing evident in his posture. Go ahead, ma'am. I've faced worse than security guards. The sound of Karen's heels clicking against the floor echoed through the silent restaurant as she stormed to her office. The hostess looked at James apologetically, tears in her eyes. James remained where he stood, his reflection visible in the window. Behind him, dozens of phones recorded every moment, capturing an old battle being fought on a new front. Security didn't come immediately. James remained standing, his feet planted firmly as if on parade ground. Around him, the restaurant buzzed with whispered conversations and the soft sounds of phones being unlocked. Sir, a young waiter approached, his voice low. Would you like some water while you wait? Karen's voice cracked through the air from across the room. Marcus, back to your station. The waiter flinched, retreating to the kitchen. James watched him go, noting how the young man's shoulders tensed. A businessman in an expensive suit stood up from his table, approaching James. I've got the whole thing on video, sir. This isn't right. Thank you, son, James replied, his voice steady. But this isn't my first rodeo. More customers began shifting in their seats. A woman in her 60s dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Her husband, wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap, gripped his fork until his knuckles turned white. The kitchen door swung open. A cook emerged, his white apron stained with grease. Mrs. Matthews, this ain't right. My granddaddy served in Korea dash. Back in the kitchen, David. Karen's face had turned red. Or you can find another job. The cook stood his ground. Maybe I should. My granddaddy wouldn't want me working in a place like this. James watched the scene unfold, his expression unchanged. He'd seen this before, the slow awakening of consciences, the moment when people could no longer pretend they didn't see what was happening. Karen emerged from her office again, phone pressed to her ear. Yes, we need someone immediately. He's refusing to leave. No, he hasn't threatened anyone, but... She glanced at the growing number of disapproving faces. Just send someone? A young mother at a nearby table gathered her children, leaving cash on the table. As she passed James, she paused. I'm so sorry, sir. My kids won't grow up thinking this is okay. The woman's words hung in the air. James thought of his own children, grown now with families of their own. He tried to shield them from this, tried to believe things had changed enough that they wouldn't face the same battles. The hostess approached Karen, her hands shaking as she removed her name tag. Mrs. Matthews, I quit. My brother's serving right now, and I can't. Karen grabbed the young woman's arm. You walk out that door, don't bother coming back. Let her go. James's voice cut through the tension. She's made her choice. Karen released the hostess, who quickly grabbed her purse and headed for the door. As she passed James, she stopped. I'm sorry, sir. Thank you for your service. The restaurant's atmosphere had shifted. What started as uncomfortable silence had transformed into barely contained outrage. The Vietnam vet with his wife finally stood up, adjusting his cap. Been meaning to try that new place down the street anyway, he announced loudly. At least they respect what this uniform means. He approached James, snapping a sharp salute. Air Force. James returned the salute. Yes, sir. 40 years. Marines myself. 2 tours in Nam. He gestured to James's medals. Distinguished Flying Cross? Yes, sir. 68, the Marine whistled low. Hell of a year. He turned to Karen. You know what that medal means, ma'am? No, of course you don't. But you should look it up before you call security on a man who earned it. Karen's phone buzzed. She checked it, her face paling. The video's already online. It's spreading. More customers began gathering their things. A teenage girl showed her phone to her parents, the video already playing on social media. The comment section filled with outrage in real time. James watched it all with the patience of a man who had seen this scene play out before, in different decades, in different places. The faces changed, but the story remained the same. The kitchen staff had gathered near the door, whispering among themselves. The cook who'd spoken up earlier removed his apron, tossing it on a nearby table. Mrs. Matthews, he called out. My granddaddy earned a Bronze Star in Korea. Came back home and couldn't eat in places like this. I thought those days were over. He looked at James. Guess some folks want to keep living in the past. Karen paced behind the hostess stand, alternating between checking her phone and glancing anxiously at the door. The restaurant's rating was dropping by the minute as the video circulated. A group of young professionals who'd been sitting at the bar approached their table. One of them, a young black woman in a business suit, stopped in front of Karen. I've been coming here for business lunches twice a week, she said, her voice trembling with anger. Not anymore. And I'll make sure my entire firm knows why. James remained still through it all, his posture perfect, his expression dignified. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the strongest statement was silence, letting others reach their own conclusions. The sound of heavy boots on the restaurant's wooden floor drew everyone's attention. Two security guards entered, their uniforms crisp and professional. The younger of the two took in the scene, the standing customers, the recording phones, the palpable tension. But it was the older guard who stepped forward first, his eyes fixed on James's chest, reading the medals there. His hand moved slowly to his cap. The restaurant collectively held its breath. The older security guard's hand trembled slightly as he removed his cap. His partner looked confused, glancing between him and Karen, who stood with her phone still clutched tightly. Master Sergeant Wilson? The guard's voice cracked slightly. James studied the man's face. Do I know you, son? No, sir, but I know of you. My father served under you in 75. Desert operations. The guard straightened his back. He told me stories about the man who flew through a sandstorm to save his unit. Karen stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply. I called you here to remove him, not chat about war stories. The guard turned to her, his expression hardening. Ma'am, do you have any idea who this man is? That's not relevant, Karen snapped. He's disrupting my business. Disrupting? A customer shouted from the back. He's standing there while you're the one causing a scene. The younger guard shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, we're not seeing any disruption here. The restaurant had become a pressure cooker. More phones recorded, more people stood, and the tension built with each passing second. Outside, a local news van pulled into the parking lot. I want him out. Karen's voice rose, hitting a pitch that made several people wince. This is my restaurant, and I have the right the right to what exactly? The older guard interrupted. His name tag read Peterson. The right to discriminate against a decorated veteran? Because that's what the video shows, ma'am. The video that's now trending on 3 different platforms. James finally spoke, his voice calm, but carrying through the restaurant. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just wanted lunch in a place that means something to me. A reporter and cameraman entered, quickly assessing the scene. Karen's face went from red to white. Get out, all of you. She pointed at the news crew. This is private property. Peterson stepped between Karen and James. Ma'am, if you insist on removal, we'll need to file an official report, including the reason for removal. Would you like to state that reason for the record? The reporter moved closer, microphone extended. Karen's composure cracked completely. Because we have standards. A dress code. A dress code that excludes military uniforms? The reporter asked, her voice sharp. Or are there other standards at play here? The younger guard took off his cap now, too. Ma'am, we can't remove someone without cause. And being a decorated veteran isn't cause. The kitchen door swung open again. An elderly black man in a cook's uniform emerged, his hands shaking as he wiped them on his apron. "Miss Karen," he said softly, "I've been cooking here since your daddy bought this place from Mr. Freeman. 30 years. Never thought I'd see the day we turned away a soldier. Never thought I'd see Freeman's come to this." Karen spun toward him. "Get back in the kitchen, Joe." "No, ma'am." He untied his apron. "I quit. My boy's serving right now. What if someone treated him this way?" James watched the old cook, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Joe? Joe Turner?" The cook squinted. Then his face broke into a wide smile. "Lord have mercy. Little Jimmy Wilson? Used to come in here with that pretty wife of yours." "Sarah," James said softly. "Yes, sir." Joe moved forward, ignoring Karen's protests. "Boy, you were no bigger than a minute when you first came in here. All pressed and proper in that uniform. Sarah would be—" He choked up. "She would be proud to see you standing tall today." The reporter's cameraman captured every moment. Peterson and his partner stood at parade rest, flanking James like an honor guard. "This has gone far enough." Karen grabbed her phone again. "I'm calling the police." "Already here, ma'am." A uniformed officer stepped through the door, followed by two others. "We received multiple calls about a disturbance." Karen rushed to them. "Finally, I want him arrested for trespassing." The lead officer, an older man with captain's bars, surveyed the scene. His eyes locked on James's medals, then moved to the news crew, the recording phones, and the growing crowd outside the windows. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I suggest you think very carefully about your next move. Because right now, you're trending on every social media platform in the state. The mayor's office just called us directly." A young woman from the bar approached, her phone out. "The video has over 100,000 views already. Comments are, 'Not kind to your establishment, Mrs. Matthews.'" The captain turned to James. "Sir, would you like to press charges for discrimination?" James shook his head slowly. "No, sir. That's not why I came here." "Then why did you stay?" Karen's voice was barely a whisper now. "Why didn't you just leave?" The restaurant fell silent, waiting for his answer. James looked around at the faces, young, old, black, white, all watching, all recording, all part of this moment. "Because 40 years ago, I had to use the back door of this restaurant. Mr. Freeman changed that. Changed minds. Showed people better was possible." James straightened his jacket. "I stayed because running away never fixed anything. Sometimes you have to stand your ground, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Outside, more news vans arrived. Inside, phones kept recording, capturing every word. The world was watching Freeman's restaurant again, just like it had 40 years ago. Only this time, the battle wasn't being fought with sit-ins or protests. It was being fought with dignity, phones, and the quiet courage of standing still. The police captain's radio crackled with activity. More units were responding to calls, but not about James, about the growing crowd outside. Veterans from nearby bases had seen the viral video and were arriving, many in full uniform. "Ma'am," the captain addressed Karen, "we need to resolve this peacefully. Right now." Karen stared through the windows at the gathering crowd. Her carefully maintained world was crumbling, one social media share at a time. Security guard Peterson stepped forward, his voice firm. "Mrs. Matthews, my father told me something about Master Sergeant Wilson that you should know." He turned to James. "Sir, permission to speak about Operation Sandstorm?" James nodded slowly. "Granted, son." Peterson stood straighter. "In 1975, my father's unit was caught in a sandstorm during a covert operation. No other pilots would fly. Visibility was zero. They were running out of supplies, taking enemy fire." He pointed to one of James's medals. "This man flew in, blind, used nothing but instruments and guts. Saved 32 men that day, including my father." The reporter moved closer, microphone extended. "Master Sergeant Wilson, would you care to comment on that mission?" "Not much to tell," James replied. "Had a job to do. Did it." A commotion at the door drew everyone's attention. 3 elderly men in American Legion caps pushed through, followed by a group of active-duty soldiers in uniform. "We saw the video," one of the Legion members announced. "Came to stand with our brother." Karen backed away, bumping into a table. "This is private property. You can't just dash." "Actually, ma'am," the police captain interrupted, "these sidewalks are public property. And given the situation, I'd strongly advise against any attempts to remove peaceful veterans from the premises." The young security guard who had remained quiet finally spoke up. "Mrs. Matthews, I can't do this. My sister's deployed right now. He removed his security company patch. "I quit." Peterson nodded at his partner. "Same here, ma'am. Some orders you can't follow." The restaurant had become a storm center. Outside, more veterans arrived. Inside, phones kept recording. The kitchen staff had completely abandoned their posts, standing in solidarity near James. Old Joe Turner approached James again. "Remember when Mr. Freeman put up that photo wall? All them servicemen who ate here?" "Yes, sir," James replied. "Sarah's favorite spot to sit. She'd tell everyone who'd listen about each picture." "Mrs. Matthews took it down first week she bought the place," Joe said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Said it didn't fit the new image." The reporter's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Matthews, would you care to comment on that decision?" Karen's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, face draining of color. "My partners, they're calling an emergency board meeting. Might want to take that call," the police captain suggested. "Meanwhile, I've got dozens of decorated veterans outside who'd like to know why one of their own was denied service." James hadn't moved from his spot. His posture remained perfect, his expression dignified. He'd become the calm center of a storm he never wanted to create. A young soldier in current Army dress uniform approached him. "Sir, I saw the video. Call my unit. They're coming too." He saluted sharply. "We've got your 6, Master Sergeant." James returned the salute. The restaurant filled with the sound of chairs scraping as every veteran present stood and saluted. Even some civilians stood, hands over hearts. Karen's phone buzzed again. This time, she answered. Yes, I understand, but yes, I see the numbers." Her voice shook. "The stock is down how much?" The reporter turned to her cameraman. "Are we live?" "5 minutes ago," he replied. "All local channels picked it up. National's asking for the feed." Peterson moved to stand beside James. "My father said you never left a man behind. Said you showed him what real leadership looked like." He faced Karen. "Ma'am, you've got 2 choices right now. You can double down and watch your restaurant die on national television, or you can remember what this place used to stand for." The crowd outside had grown larger. Veterans of different eras stood shoulder to shoulder. Some held American flags. Others held up phones, streaming the scene live. A young woman in Air Force dress blues pushed through the door. "Master Sergeant Wilson?" Her voice cracked with emotion. "Sir, I fly the same routes you did. They teach us about Operation Sandstorm and training. You're a legend, sir." More military personnel filed in behind her. The restaurant, large as it was, began to feel crowded. Karen pressed herself against the wall, watching her authority dissolve. The police captain keyed his radio. "Dispatch, we're going to need traffic control out here. And can someone get the mayor's office on the line? This is becoming a situation." James finally moved, taking a single step forward. The crowd parted like water. He approached Karen, his movements steady and deliberate. "Ma'am," he said softly, 40 years ago, Mr. Freeman had a choice too. He chose to be better than his time. Chose to see people as people." He gestured to the crowd. "All these folks? They're not here for me. They're here because some battles still need fighting. Some wrongs still need righting." Karen's phone buzzed yet again. This time, when she looked at it, her hands trembled. "The board," she whispered. "They're voting to remove me." The restaurant fell silent, waiting for her response. Outside, more veterans arrived. Inside, history held its breath. The battle for Freeman's restaurant wasn't over. But the odds had shifted dramatically, and James Wilson, who had once been forced to use the back door, stood at the center of it all, a quiet testament to how far they'd come, and how far they still had to go. Karen's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Each notification brought more bad news. Plummeting ratings, viral hashtags, and an avalanche of negative press. She stared at the screen, watching 40 years of business reputation crumble in real time. "Ma'am?" The reporter stepped closer. Our viewers would like to know, what's your response to the online backlash? A young soldier in the crowd held up his phone. 2 million views and counting. It's trending nationwide. The board, Karen said, her voice barely audible. They're watching the live stream. The police captain checked his own phone. Chief says the mayor's on his way. This has become a city issue. James remained where he stood, watching it all unfold. A young black lieutenant in Air Force dress blues approached him, tablet in hand. Sir, permission to show you something? She pulled up a social media feed. They're sharing your service record. Operation Sandstorm, the rescue missions, everything. You're trending, sir. Old Joe Turner wiped his eyes. Always knew this day would come. Freedom rings different when it goes viral. More military personnel filled the restaurant, their uniforms representing every branch of service. The kitchen staff had started serving water to the veterans, ignoring Karen's presence completely. A new notification sound cut through the murmur. Karen's phone displayed an incoming video call from the board of directors. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped it. Speaker, the reporter suggested. Let everyone hear. Karen hesitated, then hit the speaker button. A stern voice filled the restaurant. Karen, the board has reached a decision. Your actions have caused irreparable harm to our brand. Effective immediately. Wait. Karen's voice cracked. Please, I can fix this. How? The voice demanded. The stock has dropped 15% in an hour. We're getting calls from every major news network. Veterans groups are calling for a nationwide boycott. The young security guard who had quit stepped forward. Ma'am, maybe it's time to admit you were wrong. A new commotion at the door drew attention. A group of elderly men in veterans' caps entered, led by a familiar face. Bill Freeman himself, the original owner, now in his 80s, but standing tall. Heard there was trouble in my old place, he announced, his voice carrying. Saw the video? He spotted James and smiled. Jimmy Wilson, still standing tall, I see. James snapped to attention. Mr. Freeman, sir? Bill Freeman made his way through the crowd, which parted respectfully. He looked around the restaurant, noting the changes, until his eyes landed on Karen. Young lady, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. You bought more than just a building when you took over Freeman's. You bought a legacy. The board member's voice crackled through Karen's phone. Mr. Freeman? Is that you? Yes, it is. Freeman moved closer to the phone. And I'd like to remind the board of the covenant in the original sale contract. The one about maintaining the restaurant's historical significance and community standing. Karen's face went pale. What covenant? Paragraph 12, Freeman replied. The one that gives me right of first refusal if the restaurant's community standing is compromised. I'd say turning away a decorated veteran qualifies. The reporter's eyes lit up. Mr. Freeman, are you saying you could legally reclaim ownership? My lawyers are reviewing the contract now. Freeman smiled. They're very interested in today's events. The board member's voice turned sharp. Karen, the vote is unanimous. You're terminated, effective immediately. Mr. Freeman, expect a call from our legal team within the hour. The call ended. Karen slumped against the wall, her carefully constructed world collapsing completely. James watched her, his expression neutral. Sometimes the hardest part isn't standing up, he said quietly. It's admitting when you're standing on the wrong side. Social media continued to explode. The young lieutenant's tablet displayed a constant stream of updates. Sir, she reported, veterans groups across the country are organizing solidarity gatherings at their local restaurants. They're calling it #StandWithWilson. Old Joe Turner laughed softly. Ain't that something? All them years serving tables. Never thought I'd see the day when the whole world would watch Freeman's again. Bill Freeman turned to James. Got something to show you. He pulled out his phone, displaying an old photograph. Remember this? James leaned in. The photo showed a much younger version of himself and Sarah, sitting in their usual booth. She was beaming, his new lieutenant's bars gleaming on his uniform. First promotion dinner, James said softly. Sarah was so proud. That photo used to hang right there. Freeman pointed to a now bare wall, along with hundreds of others. Generations of service members who made this place special. The reporter moved closer. Mr. Freeman, what do you plan to do if you regain control? First thing, he looked around the restaurant. Put those photos back up. Remind folks what this place stands for. He turned to James. And make sure certain people never have to wonder if they're welcome here. Outside, the crowd had grown even larger. Veterans from 3 states had begun arriving, drawn by the viral story. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing the scene. Karen's phone buzzed one final time. She read the message, then slowly removed her name tag. The board's lawyers. She swallowed hard. They want me to make a public statement. To apologize. The restaurant fell silent. All eyes turned to James Wilson, the man whose quiet dignity had sparked a firestorm. The battle for Freeman's restaurant had entered its final phase. But the war for hearts and minds? That was just beginning. The restaurant's atmosphere crackled with tension as Karen faced the news cameras. Her carefully styled hair had begun to fray, her pink blazer wrinkled from hours of stress. She cleared her throat. I've been asked to make a statement. Take your time, Bill Freeman said, his voice carrying a weight of decades. Some words need careful choosing. James stood quietly, watching the scene unfold. Around him, phones recorded every moment, every hesitation, every flicker of emotion that crossed Karen's face. The young Air Force lieutenant checked her tablet again. Sir, major networks are picking up the feed. This is going live coast to coast. Karen smoothed her blazer, a gesture of habit more than effect. Her voice cracked. I want to apologize to Master Sergeant Wilson. For what exactly? The reporter pressed. Be specific, Mrs. Matthews. The silence stretched. Outside, the crowd had grown so large that police had closed off the street. Veterans of every era stood shoulder to shoulder, watching through the windows. For discriminating against him, Karen finally said, the words seeming to physically pain her. For dishonoring his service and everything this restaurant once stood for. Old Joe Turner stepped forward, his cook's apron still tied around his waist. Miss Karen, I got a question if you don't mind. She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. 30 years I worked here, Joe said. Serve your daddy, serve Mr. Freeman before him. All that time, you ever once asked why we kept the military photos up? Karen shook her head. Because every face on that wall told a story, Joe continued. Every uniform represented sacrifice. Mr. Freeman understood that. Your daddy understood that. When do you forget? The young security guard who had quit spoke up. My sister's deployed right now. She could be in one of those photos someday. If she came home and someone treated her like this. I was wrong, Karen whispered, then louder. I was wrong. Bill Freeman moved to stand beside James. Being wrong isn't the sin, young lady. Staying wrong is... The police captain's radio crackled. Sir, mayor's here. The restaurant's door opened, admitting the mayor and his staff. He took in the scene, the cameras, the veterans, the tension, and moved directly to James. Master Sergeant Wilson, he said, extending his hand. On behalf of the city, I want to apologize. James shook the offered hand. No need, Mr. Mayor. This isn't about apologies anymore. Then what is it about? Karen asked, genuine confusion in her voice. James looked around the restaurant, at the faces young and old, at the uniforms spanning generations of service. It's about remembering who we are, who we can be. The young lieutenant's tablet chimed again. Sir, veterans groups are organizing fundraisers. They want to help Mr. Freeman buy back the restaurant. Bill Freeman smiled. Won't be necessary. Already got the financing lined up. Just waiting on the lawyers now. Karen's phone buzzed. She read the message, her shoulders slumping. The board, they've approved the sale. They're returning the restaurant to Mr. Freeman. A cheer went up from the crowd outside. Inside, the veterans stood straighter, pride visible in their bearing. First order of business, Freeman announced, his voice strong despite his age. Joe, you still remember how to make those prime ribs? Old Joe grinned. Yes, sir, Mr. Freeman. Never forgot. Good. Because Master Sergeant Wilson's lunch is long overdue. Freeman turned to the kitchen staff. Anyone who walked out in protest, your jobs are secure. Anyone who stayed, he let the sentence hang. Several staff members removed their aprons, heading for the door without a word. The mayor stepped forward. Mr. Freeman, the city would be honored to help restore the photo wall. Our archives should have copies of most of the original pictures. And we've got new ones to add, the young lieutenant said, gesturing to the uniformed men and women filling the restaurant. Karen stood alone now, watching her world transform. What happens now? Now! James finally spoke. Now we do what we've always done. We learn. We grow. We move forward. Bill Freeman nodded. Karen, before you leave, there's something you should see. He pulled out his phone again, showing her an old photograph. Know who that is? She leaned in, studying the image. A young black airman stood proudly in his uniform, arm around a beaming white man in a restaurant owner's apron. That's your father, Freeman said softly. Day he decided to integrate Freeman's. Said it was the right thing to do, no matter what it cost him. He let that sink in. Your father understood what this place meant, what it could be. Karen's carefully maintained composure finally broke. Tears streaked her makeup as she stared at the photograph of her father, seeing him in a new light. The reporter stepped closer. Mrs. Matthews, would you like to make a final statement? Karen looked at James, then at the crowd of veterans, then back at the photo of her father. I'm sorry. I forgot what this place stood for. What my father stood for? James nodded once, acknowledgement rather than acceptance. Old Joe had disappeared into the kitchen. Now he emerged, carrying a plate. Master Sergeant Wilson, your usual booth is ready. The restaurant erupted in applause as James made his way to the corner booth, his and Sarah's booth. As he sat down, Joe placed the plate before him with a flourish. Prime rib, medium rare, Joe announced. Just like old times, Bill Freeman addressed the crowd. Freeman's restaurant is back, folks. And this time, we're going to make sure it stays true to what it's always been. A place where service means something. Where everyone stands equal. Outside, the sun had begun to set. The crowd remained, phones recording, witnesses to a moment when the past and present collided, and the future hung in the balance. And in his booth, James Wilson finally began his meal, surrounded by a new generation of servicemen and women who had stood with him, proving that some battles were still worth fighting, some victories still worth winning. James cut into his prime rib, the familiar aroma bringing back decades of memories. Around him, the restaurant hummed with activity as Bill Freeman began directing the restoration of his beloved establishment. First thing tomorrow, Freeman announced, those photos go back up. Every single one of them. The young Air Force lieutenant approached James's booth, tablet still in hand. Sir, the story's gone international. Veterans in other countries are sharing their own experiences. James set down his fork. Pull up a chair, Lieutenant. Everyone's welcome at this table now. She sat, her eyes bright with emotion. Sir, may I ask, how did you stay so calm? I watched the video a dozen times. You never lost your composure. Anger's easy, James replied, cutting another piece of prime rib. Dignity's harder, but it lasts longer. Old Joe appeared with coffee, pouring cups for both of them. Remember what you told my boy when he enlisted, Jimmy? About wearing the uniform? James nodded. Told him the uniform doesn't make the man. The man makes the uniform. The restaurant's door opened again, admitting a group of elderly veterans. Among them was a face James hadn't seen in decades. Wilson, a tall man with silver hair, stepped forward. Jimmy Wilson? James stood immediately, recognizing his old squadron commander. Colonel Roberts, sir. The two men embraced, years falling away in an instant. Roberts pulled back, gripping James's shoulders. Saw it on the news, Roberts said, his voice thick. Called every man from the old unit who could make it. They're on their way. The reporter moved closer, sensing another story. Colonel, you served with Master Sergeant Wilson? Roberts turned to the camera. Serve with him? Lady, this man saved my life in that sandstorm. Saved all of us? He faced James again. Still got that old photo from base? The one after the rescue? James reached into his uniform pocket, pulling out a weathered photograph. The reporter's cameraman zoomed in as James handed it to Roberts. The photo showed a younger James covered in sand, standing beside his aircraft. Behind him, 32 grateful men posed, All of them alive because one pilot refused to let a sandstorm stop him. "Tell them, Jim," Roberts urged. "Tell them what you said when they asked why you flew in." James shook his head modestly, but Roberts persisted. He said, "The storm doesn't care what color we are. Why should I?" Roberts' voice carried through the restaurant. "That's who this man is. That's what that uniform means." Bill Freeman had been listening. Now he stepped forward, addressing the growing crowd. "That's what this restaurant meant too. Still means. Will mean again." Karen remained in the corner, watching silently as her former establishment transformed. The mayor approached her. "Mrs. Matthews," he said quietly, "I think it's time." She nodded, gathering her belongings. At the door, she paused, looking back at James's table. The booth that had once been a symbol of exclusion now hosted a growing gathering of veterans, young and old, all colors, all services. "Master Sergeant Wilson?" Her voice wavered. "Before I go, could you tell me about my father? About the day this place was integrated?" James gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Sit down, Mrs. Matthews. It's a story worth hearing." The restaurant fell quiet as James began to speak, his voice carrying decades of memory. "It was 1965. I just got my wings. Your father was behind the counter when I walked in, same spot Joe stands now." James paused, sipping his coffee. "Back then, most places had two doors. But your father? He saw the uniform first, saw the wings. Said any man willing to die for his country deserved to walk through the front door." Karen's eyes filled with tears. "He never told me. Some stories are hard to tell," James said. "But they're important to remember." The young lieutenant scrolled through her tablet. "Sir, people are sharing similar stories from all over. About restaurants, businesses, places that changed because someone took a stand. Like you did today," Roberts added. James shook his head. "No, Colonel. Like we all did. Every person who stood up, spoke out, recorded, shared. That's how change happens. Not all at once, but one moment, one choice at a time." Bill Freeman had been busy on his phone. Now he addressed the crowd again. "Just heard from the lawyers. It's official. Freeman's restaurant is back under original ownership." A cheer went up. Outside, the crowd had begun to thin, but media trucks remained, broadcasting live. "And our first order of business," Freeman continued, "is reinstating our military discount. Active duty, veterans, families, all of them." Old Joe emerged from the kitchen with more plates. "And these prime ribs? On the house today. For everyone in uniform." Karen stood slowly. "Mr. Freeman, before I go, there's something you should have." She reached into her purse, pulling out a thick envelope. "The original photos. I never threw them away. Couldn't bring myself to." Freeman took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you, Karen. Your father would be proud of that choice, at least." The young security guard who had quit stepped forward. "Sir, permission to help put them back up?" "Granted," Freeman smiled. "We'll need all the help we can get." As Karen finally walked out the door, James's voice stopped her one last time. "Mrs. Matthews?" He waited until she turned. "Your father was right, you know. About the front door. About who deserves to walk through it." She nodded once, tears falling freely now, and left Freeman's restaurant for the last time. Inside, James returned to his meal, surrounded by old comrades and new friends. The booth that had once been his and Sarah's special place had become something more, a symbol of change, of progress, of battles fought and won. Colonel Roberts raised his coffee cup. "To Jimmy Wilson, still teaching us how to fly through storms." The toast was echoed throughout the restaurant, but James just smiled and cut another piece of prime rib. Some victories, he knew, were best celebrated quietly, with dignity. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows through Freeman's windows, but no one seemed eager to leave. Old Joe kept the coffee flowing as Bill Freeman and volunteers carefully began restoring the photo wall. Each image a piece of history returned to its rightful place. "This one's from '68, Freeman said, holding up a faded photograph. "First Christmas after integration. Had a line out the door." James watched from his booth as younger veterans crowded around the older ones, eager to hear stories of the restaurant's history. The young Air Force lieutenant sat beside him, recording everything on her tablet. "For the archives, sir," she explained. "Future generations should know what happened here today." Colonel Roberts, still at James's table, pulled out his phone. "Speaking of future generations, Jim, remember that young pilot who asked about Operation Sandstorm last year? The one who said he'd never fly in those conditions?" James nodded. "He just texted me. Saw the video. Says he understands now." Roberts showed James the message. "Says sometimes the storm isn't in the sky." The restaurant's door opened again, admitting a group of young black service members in current uniforms. They approached James's table, standing at attention. "Master Sergeant Wilson?" Their leader spoke. "We're from the local Air Force ROTC. Our instructor, your son, sent us." James's expression softened. "Marcus called you?" "Yes, sir. Said we needed to see what real leadership looks like." The cadet's voice trembled slightly. "Said his father taught him that some battles don't need weapons. Just courage." Bill Freeman called out from the photo wall. "Found another one, Jim. You and Sarah, Day Marcus got his commission." The photo made its way to James's table. He held it carefully, remembering that proud day. His son in his new uniform, Sarah beaming, himself standing tall beside them. "Your wife will be proud," old Joe said softly, refilling coffee cups. "She always said this place was more than just a restaurant." The young security guard who had quit was helping with the photos. "Sir, we found something interesting." He held up a newspaper clipping from 1965. "It's about the day the restaurant integrated." The reporter moved closer. "May I see that?" The yellowed article told the story. "Local restaurant takes stand against segregation." The photo showed a younger Bill Freeman shaking hands with James's father, both men smiling despite the angry crowd visible in the background. "I remember that day," Freeman said, his voice carrying. "Reporter asked me if I was worried about losing business. Told him some things matter more than money." The mayor, who had stayed to help manage the media presence, stepped forward. "Mr. Freeman, the city council is convening an emergency session. They want to declare Freeman's restaurant a historical landmark." "About time," Colonel Roberts commented. "This place has more history than most museums." The young lieutenant's tablet chimed again. "Sir, you're going to want to see this." She turned the screen toward James. "It's trending nationwide. Hashtag Stand with Wilson has become hashtag Stand for Change." James watched as stories poured in from across the country. Other veterans sharing similar experiences, other businesses pledging to do better, other people standing up against discrimination. "You started something bigger than us, Jim," Roberts said quietly. "No, Colonel," James replied. "We all did. Every person who walked out today. Every phone that recorded. Every voice that spoke up." Bill Freeman approached their table, carrying another photograph. This one showed the restaurant's original staff from 1962. All white except for one black dishwasher in the back. "My father," old Joe said proudly, "started as a dishwasher, became head cook. Mr. Freeman gave him a chance when nobody else would. And now," Freeman added, "his son's been running my kitchen for 30 years. The ROTC cadets had been listening intently. Their leader spoke up again. "Sir, would you tell us about Operation Sandstorm? About why you flew when no one else would?" James set down his coffee cup. The restaurant grew quiet, everyone waiting for his answer. "It wasn't about being brave," he said finally. "It was about doing what's right. Those men needed help. Didn't matter who they were, what they looked like. Storm was trying to kill them just the same. Like today," the young lieutenant added. "Different storm, same principle." James nodded. "Life gives you choices. Each one matters. Each one ripples out, touches others." Bill Freeman held up another photo, this one showing James and Sarah at their wedding reception, celebrated right there in the restaurant. "Every ripple leaves a mark," Freeman said. "Every stand changes something." The security guard called out from the photo wall. "Mr. Freeman, we're running out of space. There's so many photos." "Then we'll make more space," Freeman replied. "Every person who stood with us today gets their picture up there. New generation, new history." The reporter, who had been broadcasting live all afternoon, turned to James. "Master Sergeant, what would you say to others facing similar situations? What's your message to them?" James stood slowly, his bearings still military straight despite the long day. The restaurant fell silent, waiting for his words. "Tell them the uniform isn't just cloth," he said. "The medals aren't just metal. They're promises. Promises we made to stand up, stand tall, stand together." He looked around at the faces watching him. "Tell them some storms you fly through, others you stand against, but you never face them alone." Colonel Roberts stood too, followed by every service member in the restaurant. A spontaneous salute rippled through the crowd. Outside, the last light of day painted the sky in deep purples and oranges. Inside Freeman's restaurant, history was being restored, photo by photo, story by story. And at the center of it all, James Wilson stood tall, just as he had 40 years ago, when he first walked through the front door. Some victories echo through time. Some storms change everything they touch. And some stands never really end. Night had fallen outside Freeman's restaurant, but inside, the lights burned bright. The photo wall was nearly complete, decades of history restored alongside new images from this historic day. Bill Freeman stood back, surveying the work with satisfaction. "One space left," he announced. "Save it special." James looked up from his booth, where he'd been sharing stories with 3 generations of service members. "What's that, Mr. Freeman?" The old restaurateur smiled, holding up a digital camera. "Need a new photo. You, me, and old Joe. Past, present, and future of Freeman's." The young Air Force lieutenant quickly stood. "I'll take it, sir." James rose from his booth, straightening his uniform out of habit. Old Joe wiped his hands on his apron and joined them. The 3 men stood before the photo wall, beneath the spot where the first integration photo had hung in 1965. "Wait," Colonel Roberts called out. He approached with something in his hands, the folded American flag from the restaurant's original flagpole. "Need this in the picture, too." The lieutenant positioned them carefully, the flag held between them. Behind her, phones and cameras raised to capture the moment. "Smile," she said, but they already were. The flash popped, capturing something more than just 3 men and a flag. It captured a legacy, a promise, a future. "Perfect," Freeman said, checking the image. "That's going right here, next to the original." The mayor, who had been coordinating with his office, approached the group. "Gentlemen, the city council's vote was unanimous. Freeman's restaurant is now officially a historical landmark." A cheer went up from the crowd that still filled the restaurant. Old Joe wiped his eyes with his apron. "My daddy would have never believed it," he said softly. His little boy's picture going up on a historical landmark. The young security guard who had quit raised his hand. "Mr. Freeman, there's someone here to see you." Through the door walked Karen Matthews, but not the same Karen from earlier. Her makeup was gone, her hair simple, her pink blazer replaced with a casual sweater. She carried a large box. The restaurant grew quiet. James watched her approach, his expression neutral, but not unkind. She set the box down carefully. "I found these in storage. All the old menus, guest books, photographs that didn't make it to the wall." She turned to Freeman. "They belong here. They belong to the legacy." Freeman opened the box, pulling out a leather-bound guest book. 1962, he read. "Year we open." He flipped through the pages, stopping suddenly. "Look at this, Jim." James moved closer. There in faded ink was his own signature. Below it, Sarah's elegant handwriting. Their first visit before the integration, when they'd been forced to use the back door. "Keep reading," Karen said quietly. Freeman turned the page. There they were again, but this time from 1965, the first night they'd walked through the front door. And again in 1970, after Vietnam. 1975, after Operation Sandstorm. 1980, when Marcus was born. Page after page of history, written in ink and memory. The young lieutenant had been recording everything on her tablet. "Sir, the video of Mrs. Matthews' apology is going viral now. People are calling it a teaching moment." Karen stepped forward, facing James directly. "I meant what I said earlier. I am sorry. But more than that, I understand now. What this place means. What it stands for." James studied her face for a moment. "Understanding's the first step. Action's the second." "I know," she replied. "That's why I've been talking to veterans groups. Learning. Listening, she turned to Freeman. And if you'll have me, I'd like to help restore Freeman's to what it should be. Old Joe spoke up from behind the counter. Always need help in the kitchen. Best place to learn about people. Serving them good food with respect. Freeman raised an eyebrow. Kitchen work's not easy. Not like running an office. I know, Karen said. I'm ready to learn. To earn back trust. To honor my father's legacy. Not hide from it. James watched this exchange silently, but something in his expression softened. He recognized the courage it took to return, to face what you'd done wrong, to try to make it right. The young ROTC cadets had gathered nearby, witnessing this moment of redemption. Their leaders stepped forward. Sir, he addressed James. What you said earlier about storms. Some you fly through, others you stand against. James nodded. Is there a third kind? The cadet asked. The kind you learned from? James smiled. Son, those are all the same storm. Just depends on whether you're running from it, fighting it, or letting it change you. Bill Freeman had been flipping through more of the old guest books. Now he looked up. Karen, you really want to learn? Want to be part of this legacy? She nodded firmly. Then grab an apron. Joel'll show you how we do things here. Freeman turned to the crowd. Freeman's restaurant is open for business, folks. Really open. For everybody. The young lieutenant's tablet chimed one final time. Sir, the stories reached overseas. Military bases around the world are sending messages of support. They're calling it the Freeman's Effect. One small stand sparking bigger change. James returned to his booth, his and Sarah's booth, and looked around at what one day had brought. The photo wall, restored and expanded. Old wounds beginning to heal. New understanding taking root. Colonel Roberts raised his coffee cup one last time to Freeman's restaurant. Past, present, and future. The toast echoed through the restaurant. Outside, the night was deep and dark, but inside Freeman's, the lights burned bright. They would stay bright. Welcome lights in the darkness, guiding the way forward. Old Joe started up the grill, teaching Karen the rhythms of the kitchen. Bill Freeman hung the final photo, 3 men and a flag, standing together against time. And James Wilson sat in his booth, watching it all, knowing that some victories don't end with a single battle. Some change doesn't come in a single moment. Some storms teach us how to fly. Some stands show us how to grow. And some restaurants become more than just places to eat. They become places to remember who we are and who we can be, together.